Hello, everybody. I have Nicole Bijlsma with me for part 3 of this series. How do you care for your health if you are living in a water damaged building or a building that has mold? Ideally, you get out of the building, and we know well that you really can't recover your health if it is affecting you while you're living in these buildings. But occasionally for some patients, that's not an easy thing to do, to move out of these buildings. It's a big thing when somebody finds out that they are living in a water damaged building or a building that has toxic mold that they're exposed to. It's one of the hardest things I really hate doing with patients. And I love that I've got building biologists to go in and sort of be the bad guy and go, yeah, this is a problem. But quite often, it's not as easy, and especially in this area, to find housing. We have such a huge housing shortage. And so what are things patients can do if they find they have to stay in these buildings? If you can just touch a little bit on air purifiers and dehumidifiers and the effect of them in these environments.
Absolutely. And that's an awful scenario to be in, knowing that your house is making you sick and, you're at odds as to what you can do about it because you can't move out, which of course is the number one thing you'd want to do. The main thing is don't clean it. If you clean it, your exposure increases so much that most of my clients with chronic inflammatory response could be sick for weeks or months after cleaning just a pair of leather shoes. So do not clean visible mold off surfaces. Get someone who is relatively healthy in your family with a full face respirator on to clean the non-porous surfaces, but not the person in there. During the time that they're going to clean any surfaces, which shouldn't be the one who's got asthma, allergies or chronic fatigue, you make sure that there's air filters or air scrubbers on at the time at very high, at their highest setting. So as it's coming off the surface, it's being filtered through the air filter is really important. Any porous surfaces that are visible mold need to be put in a garbage bag and removed immediately. Don't salvage them. Otherwise, it's time and time again, people just get sick and sick. They don't underestimate that just cleaning any visible mold off porous or semi-porous surfaces like clothes and shoes can make them sick for months. And that's why. And the fact that the media
as well, like they bedding, so they'll kind of strip all their bedding and their pillows. And I do have, it's interesting that you say this, Nicole, a lot of patients that say, I've been living with this mold for ages, and then I decided I should clean it, and then I got really sick.
Yeah, exactly right. So the first thing they want to do is make sure they get a really good air filter that's got a good capture zone for that space. Like buying a little air filter for a big room isn't going to do anything. It needs to be
size? What size would you say?
Well, it depends on the size of the room. So there's many different air filters available. The main air filter you want is a HEPA filter, high efficiency particulate air filter. Would be the main thing, because most of the mycotoxins are on the particles, and that's why the HEPA filter is so important. So with the manufacturer, just tell them how many square meters that room is, and they'll tell you which dehumidifier and or air filter you need for that particular space. That's important.
And I have a lot of patients that say, oh, I'm running an air purifier. Do I need a dehumidifier?
So the dehumidifier is there to pull moisture out of the air to stop the problem getting worse. So if you're in a humid environment like you, absolutely you need a dehumidifier. Or if you haven't got one, use your air conditioning system, because that is a dehumidifier, providing it has been recently serviced and it's clean. 100% of all the air conditioning systems and split systems that I've seen on the walls are contaminated. If there's any sign of dirt in the air conditioning system, just get a torch, open up the fins and have a look towards the back where the barrel fan is. It's probably contaminated with Cladosporium, Aspergillus, penicillium, and will spew out more stuff. So ideally, in theory, you'd use your air conditioner because it acts as a dehumidifier, say in dry mode. But the worst thing is that if it's contaminated, it's going to exacerbate the problem. So make sure it's cleaned appropriately, not just sprayed chemicals and acid on it to make it look clean and the back of it hasn't been done. And by clean, I mean that the technician will come and bag it and get a high pressure hose to clean it properly and show you all the dirty water, check every other part of the split system to make sure that it's clean. So otherwise, a dehumidifier that's appropriately sized for that environment pulls the moisture out of the air so it stops exacerbating the existing problem. And of course, air filters are really important and they work really well. So, areas where if you're working from home, then roll the air filter towards where you are while the kids are at school, so it's cleaning the air in close your breathing zone. Of course, any child with asthma, allergies, or any occupant with those symptoms of chronic fatigue, the air filter should be in the same room as them. So if you need an air filter for every room, then it's worth the cost of doing that, because if you don't get an air filter, your body becomes the filter.
I often quote you saying that too. I go, as Nicole Bijlsma said, get a filter or be the filter. And
Exactly right.
yeah, I usually get when I quote you directly. So definitely, and cleaning air purifiers and dehumidifiers, how important is that? You know, we just sort of stick them in a corner and run them. Yeah.
So important. You've got to replace those filters. If you're in a highly contaminated environment, like the remediator replaces those filters every job. So the air filter eventually will get contaminated. At least if you're in a highly contaminated site, every 3 months, replace those filters, I would. Ideally, your air purifier would be metal case, so it can be wiped down and remediated. If it's plastic, I have found quite a few people with chronic inflammatory response saying they can no longer use their air purifiers in the next house because they can smell the mold, and even if they've replaced the filters. So I would say go with someone like Innova Air or a metal cased air purifier where you can replace the filter and use the HEPA sandwich, i.e. vacuum the case followed by microfiber cloth followed by vacuuming to clean the case itself if it's metal, and obviously doing that outside, not where it's cleaning it inside. And preferably someone who's not sick, so a friend or a family who doesn't have asthma or allergies or chronic fatigue, they'll do that on your behalf if you can't afford a remediator.
Yeah, and it is really important that you don't do it yourself. So some diets and supplements that I use, Nicole, with the Lismore floods, there was quite a few patients going, surely there's something I can do to help myself while I'm in this environment. I usually use the no amylose diet. And so it's a low starch diet, and it's a recommendation to take out all the starchy foods. Anything that grows underneath the ground, anything that grows above the ground is fine, like even corn. But any of the sugars, like the corn starches, the corn syrups, all the sweeteners, all the grains need to go, and bananas as well. And I often have patients come back and they say, look, I did that diet and, my nose has stopped running and I'm actually able to breathe a bit better. And so I have seen patients get significant results just changing the diet. So that's a really simple thing that I usually get patients to do if they're still exposed or in the environment. The other thing that I do is I use binders, and there's some really lovely binders on the market at the moment that do bind mycotoxins. There's 3. I really like the Ultra Binder, has a really strong binding force for the mycotoxins. There's a couple of others, Toxiprevent as well, but Toxiprevent, there's some question around that now. But binders are super important, and probiotics I use a lot of as well, because the gut flora is where a lot of that protein damage happens for the immune system, and where we get the immune dysregulation with these mold spores and the toxins that come from them. So binders, probiotics, and diet are 3 things I usually just do straight off the bat while people are exposed, and in particular children. I see a lot of children really struggling in these environments. The mum and dad are fine, but the kids just aren't fine.
So binders are really, really important. Often with chronic inflammatory response, the dosage meant to be tiny. The worse their symptoms, the smaller, like really small doses, because they go into detox mode and they just can't handle that. So
they get overwhelmed.
Yeah, exactly. So minute doses, not homeopathics, but really, really low. Like you said, charcoal and citrus pectin, all that sort of stuff. Zeolites can be providing it's a clean source. It's not contaminated with lead, which was the issue I had when I tested it.
Yeah, that's the problem. Well, and that leads me on to just the last part of this question. Patients that are affected by mold toxins and mycotoxins tend to be more sensitive to other environmental toxins. So maybe whereas once upon a time they were living on a main road and they could kind of handle the toxins coming from the traffic, after mycotoxin exposure, they tend to be more sensitive to other environmental toxins. Can you talk to that a little bit?
Absolutely. Once they're mold sensitive, a building biologist is trained to look for EMFs and chemical and help the client reduce their chemical load, because the myelin sheaths are demyelinating and their detoxification pathways, especially in phase 2, are compromised. That's the same pathways that your new catecholamines and neurotransmitters are going through. That's why mental health declines significantly. But also your environmental chemicals using these glutathione conjugation pathways, sulfation pathways. So they now can't wear their perfume. They can't, open the newspaper without responding to the inks. So you have to reduce. They don't get better if they're sleeping near a meter panel. They don't get better if they continue to use their cell phone in close proximity to their body. So in many ways, once they're sensitive to mold, they have to reduce their load to man-made electromagnetic fields. And that means no extenders, boosters, routers in their home, ideally hard wiring if possible. If that's not possible, they need to turn their router off when it's not in use. I often recommend clients to have a timer, like, when you go on holidays, you have a light timer to switch your lights on and off. Do that for the router so it turns off automatically is important. And definitely no Wi-Fi enabled devices in their bedroom or adjacent rooms to their bedroom, because it impacts non-REM sleep. I'm about to publish on that. And it affects their melatonin and has massive downstream effects for other health concerns and immune response. If you don't sleep, you don't get better. So that's why, sleep disturbances are common in nearly every chronic disease, has some degree of sleep disturbance, and it needs to be addressed as the first port of call.
It's an inflammatory state if you're not sleeping. I think I read a research just recently that one night of sleep deprivation will raise your interleukin 6s and they'll stay high for 3 weeks. That's one night of sleep deprivation. So the inflammatory cascade of not sleeping is massive. And if you imagine if you have night after night of this, the inflammation that comes from that. Okay, Nicole, let's leave this part there and we'll pick up the next part. How do I regain my health after being impacted from mold or mold-related illnesses? Thank you, everyone.